Okay, this is open Q&A, so whatever's on your mind. You can ask anything you like because I can always say I don't know.
I have a multifaceted question. So I think it's like 3 or 4 separate questions. But it revolves around one founding group question. My question originally started with, did Abraham wear tefillin? And did the forefathers wear tefillin? And if the forefathers wore tefillin before the Exodus, in the commentary by Rabbi Ari Kaplan, when he mentions that the tefillin were worn as a reminder of the Exodus, and the parchments within inside the tefillin are about the Exodus, how could the forefathers have had the same parchments inside the tefillin? Which then comes to the root question, being that a lot of the mitzvot in the Torah go back to the Exodus, how could the forefathers have kept the Torah before the Exodus occurred?
Okay, your question is excellent. It is discussed in great detail by many commentators. There's a fellow who was a student of mine, now I would call him a colleague, who has published several volumes of Torah essays. And this is one of the subjects that he explores in great detail. And he cites more than a dozen authorities, and they all deal with exactly your question. There are many mitzvos that depend upon national structure or tribal structure, which didn't exist in his time. And of course, the text of the Torah couldn't have existed in his time, because if so, then the events that were taking place later would have been known before they took place. I don't know the detailed answers to your question, but you're asking the right question. It has to make sense, and there are approaches all of which agree that you cannot think of them as keeping all 613 commandments. That's simply not possible. And they go into, some even raise the question whether the rabbinic commandments, there's some sources that indicate that even rabbinic commandments. So I can't give you an answer in detail, but if you like, I could lend you the book and you could read the essay. It's a fascinating essay. Just one detail that you mentioned, which I think is important. A holiday, let's say, can be an anniversary of a particular event. That would not necessarily mean that the holiday couldn't be celebrated before the event. Notice I said anniversary of. I didn't say it was created as a commemoration of, it says an anniversary. Because we could ask the prior question, why did the event take place on that date? And it could be that that date has a certain potential for that event to take place. And that potential existed maybe even from the creation. So prior generations, one of the commentators actually says this, prior generations could relate to that potential before the event took place. So the exodus from Egypt, the 15th of Nisan, if you think of the 15th of Nisan like Lahavdil, July 4th, so then there was no meaning to July 4th before the American War of Independence. But in our case, we would ask the prior question, why did the Exodus take place on the 15th of Nisan and on some other date? And we don't regard that as arbitrary. So in general terms, we would say that the 15th of Nisan has the potential to be a liberation day. And when the circumstances occurred that we had to be liberated from Egypt, that's when it took place. And prior generations could recognize that potential and interact with it even before the actual historical event of the Exodus from Egypt. So that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But the others are definitely problems. The texts couldn't exist the way they existed later, and other similar problems. So your question is gold, and if I remember, I'll bring in the book and I'll lend it to you.
I have a friend that's trying to persuade me into becoming either starting with vegetarian but becoming a vegan. And I've been kind of I'm watching this documentary, and I've been reading some stuff about it. So I would just like to see what's the Jewish point of view on the whole thing about animal torture and how this kashrus fit into the whole picture. And
I don't know a great deal about the subject. I'll share with you a few things that I do know, but there are treatments of the subject. There are books on Jewish resources on ecology and on vegetarianism and that sort of thing. Go to any good English book, Jewish bookstore, you'll find them. And maybe even some here in the library. It's not something that I've read up on in great detail. I think there's a fundamental divide here. There's one side that wants to paint animals in very romantic colors. We're all part of the web of life of the planet, the Gaia hypothesis, and we're all equally alive. We all have equal rights and equal. The Peter Singer group. This kind of romantic idea is absolutely foreign to Judaism. Indeed, the question is raised whether people before Noah were vegetarians. On a superficial reading of the first chapter of Genesis, it may seem so because it says that God gave vegetation to humans and animals as food. That's superficial because that only indicates that we have the freedom and the authority to destroy plant life for the sake of our food. That implies that we didn't have the freedom to kill animals for our food. It doesn't make you a vegetarian. The animals die spontaneously. The question whether you eat it is not settled by that. In fact, the sources are split. There are even Talmudic and Midrashic sources indicating that Adam himself ate meat. So it's not obvious that before, some say yes and some say no. I think it's Machlis Rashi and Tosfos. I remember correctly about whether they're vegetarians or not, but it's not forced. Well, some say that Noah was given the right to kill animals for food because we shouldn't classify ourselves as animals, presaging the current nonsense about man just being another animal. If you are given the right to kill an animal for food, there has to be a categorical division between your existence and the existence of animals. If there's any continuity between them, by what right would you use them as food? Drink their milk and wear their wool, but kill them for your food? So it was the idea to emphasize the idea that human beings should not classify himself as an animal, because, among other things, classifying yourself as an animal gives you the license to behave like an animal. And we see that all around us. Now, so this romanticizing animal life and projecting it as equal to humans and so on, giving it intrinsic value, that's something which the Jewish tradition rejects. The only thing that has intrinsic value is humanity. That's an important point. The only thing that has intrinsic value is humanity. Nothing else has intrinsic. Imagine a universe without people, and then that universe disappearing, there's zero loss. Nothing of value is lost. Because nothing other than human beings has intrinsic value. That's a Jewish point of view. That's one issue. Now there's a second issue, or a complex of issues. There's some people who just find themselves revolted by meat. They just can't eat it. Either just it's a sensation, they just can't tolerate it, or because of what they've read about the horrible treatment of animals, when they come to eat meat, those pictures arise in their brains and it turns on their emotions and they just can't face it. That's a condition, I would say, even of a normal human being who's nothing, no disabilities and so on and so on. And there's no reason for him to eat meat if he finds himself revolted physically or revolted socially and morally by the way animals are treated. The Jewish tradition does have mitzvos of eating meat. And when the temple stood, they couldn't be avoided. And we are praying 3 times a day that the temple should be restored and the animal sacrifices should be restored, and we should participate in those mitzvos. So to take a position against eating meat for any reason, in principle, any principle, is going to be inconsistent with Judaism. A person who says that I find it distasteful for one reason or another. Now, the idea of supporting horrific treatment of animals as a sentiment, it's a free world. You can have whatever sentiments you like, and if that moves you, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. As a moral position, that requires a lot of careful thinking. The relationship between your money that you pay for the steak and the institution of treating animals is very, very indirect. It's without doubt that if you stop eating meat, the meat industry will not be affected at all. It will not change one whit. So to think of yourself as directly responsible for torturing some animal is, I think, just romantic. There's no basis in fact. Should you be part of a mass movement and so forth? So there's a question of how you analyze mass movements and responsibility. It's also a whole philosophical rigmarole, which, if you like, we can go into, but I don't think it's directly relevant. So I think it's a multifaceted question. I think we have to be careful not to slip into fundamental values that are antithetical to Judaism or even independent of Judaism. Because Judaism is a worldview. And its worldview includes the values that the Creator put into the world. So it's not just that you mustn't step on Judaism's toes, but if you pretend to have any source of ultimate value external to Judaism, that already violates Judaism's own self-definition. And that we have to be very careful about. Now, as I say, there's much more to it than that, and I don't know any more than that. I'm just sharing with you what I know, and I would encourage you to read more about it.
You say in your essay on living up to the truth. So I'm reading it out now. They say that it's simply not credible to tell an entire nation that their collective ancestors witnessed such an earth-shattering event and that it was forgotten. Meaning that.
I don't know if anybody,
about the revelation that's there.
Yes, it's not credible that.
It's not credible to tell an entire nation that their collective ancestors witnessed such an earth-shattering event and that it was forgotten.
Yeah. Does everybody understand what he said? He's reading in a British accent. It's not credible to tell an entire nation. In other words, the picture here is somebody comes and says, your entire ancestry had the following experience. He's making it up. It's not true. And someone is trying to convince them of this fantasy. And he comes to them and says, I want you to know that 200 years ago or 500 years ago, your entire ancestry had this earth-shattering experience. And the reason you don't know about it is because everybody forgot it. That's not credible. That's what that sentence says, yeah.
Yeah, but there are other things that Torah records. We've got, let's say, the Mabul. We've got the splitting of the sea, where Torah says that all the seas and all the waters in the world split. It wasn't just Yam Suf, it was everywhere in the world. And you've got, let's say, when Yeshua told the sun to stop and the sun and the moon to stop. These are world events. It's not just one nation; it's the whole world. Yeah, so I think with the Mabul, we do find that most of the ancient nations do have recordings of the floods.
Yes.
Although I don't think nowadays, especially the modern nations, don't know about it, so they have forgotten about it. And with all the other things, people don't remember Berat Flogger. People don't remember that there was a Tower of Babel, which the whole world had participated.
Yeah, but that's not what the sentence says. The sentence doesn't say that people won't forget. The sentence says that if you come and tell them that they've forgotten their own history, they won't believe you. What you need to challenge that sentence is a case where someone came and told a nation that this happened to their ancestors, and the reason they don't know about it is that they forgot it, and they believed him. That's what that sentence denies. It doesn't deny that people will forget. It denies that when you come and tell them the story and tell them the reason they don't know about it because they forgot, they won't believe you. That's what it says.
You're saying you won't be able to convince somebody, like an atheist nowadays, you won't be able to convince him of the Mabul. He doesn't, because you're saying this is a world event, and he's forgotten that. He won't believe you. If you bring him all the proofs, he won't believe you.
Again, what your words and my words are not connecting. We're talking about a person who comes to, not an atheist, a person. That wasn't the description, right? The description was coming to a whole nation. Okay. And you tell them, this happened to your ancestors, and when they protest that they don't remember it, the speaker says, you don't remember it because it was forgotten, and they believe him and now come to believe it. That's what you'd have to find. You have to find a case where the person tells the story, and when the people protest, we don't remember it, he says to them, I understand you don't remember it. You don't understand it because it was forgotten. And they say, oh, okay, now we understand, and they accept it. That's what you need to challenge that sentence.
So you're telling me, so let's say I want to go to China, and they've got no idea about the Mabul. And I say to them, that the Mabul happened. It was a worldwide event 5,000 years ago. The whole world was flooded, and we all come from there after that. Yeah, and I'm never going to be able to get them to believe it.
Well, first of all, I don't have to extend it that far. We're in Mabu, talking about the whole of the world population dying out and ending up with 8 people. That's not the same as having a nation of 3 million people, and going back 500 years when there were 750,000 people who were their ancestors, and all 750,000 had witnessed the event, and all 750,000 told their children, and the present group is the children of those people. Here you're talking about an event that left behind 8 people altogether. So that's not the same as having the ancestry of a nation transmitting the idea to the next latest generation. There wasn't any nation there at all. So I don't have to deal with that. But that's a non-case because, as a matter of fact, that the story of it is all over the world. But again, we're talking now about taking people who don't remember, who've never heard of it, it's not part of their history or their consciousness whatsoever, and getting them to believe it.
Okay, let's take another worldwide miracle with.
Okay, so now as far as the other ones are concerned, there's 2 things to say. First of all, you're quoting Midrashim. The default is
sun stopping is a first boss in Yeshua.
okay. The right. That okay. So we can take either one. If you're quoting Midrashim, the default position of Midrashim is that they're not literal. But even when the default position with respect to Midrash is that it is not literal, that's the default position. Only if you have a commentator who says that it's to be taken literally, should it be taken literally. If you just read a Midrash, the starting position is it's not literal. It's meant symbolically, it's meant morally, it's not meant as literal history, number one. And number two, even if you have a record that the event took place, human memory is very selective. And in particular, events are remembered when they make a difference, when something changes. But when nothing changes, when life goes on as it went on before, then events are typically not remembered. Eclipses. Ancient peoples did not make records of eclipses. Only a couple. The rest of them, it happened, and then they went on with their lives. People were born before the eclipse and after the eclipse. The king still collected his taxes after the eclipse like before the eclipse. It didn't make any difference to anyone, number one. Number two, ancient peoples were surrounded by miracles. They were surrounded by miracles. The sun shining is a miracle. The rain falling is a miracle. When your army wins a battle, it's your gods helping you. It's a miracle. They're surrounded by miracles. Don't project the contemporary mental set on the ancient world. It doesn't fit. So this is another miracle. So what? Why didn't all the Egyptians become believers in Judaism when they saw the plagues? Because they have a yearly gigantic miracle when the Nile overflows and provides them with fertility. So your God did something. What's he done lately? Has your God done anything in the last 10 years? No, our God's still working. Come and be an Egyptian. You'll get a lot of wealth and a lot of fertile land because the Nile God is still working. They were surrounded by miracles continuously. Now, let's say the seas all split. Let's say the seas all split. Okay, what happened before and what happened afterwards? Nothing. So another thing happens. Some of these miracles happen regularly. Some of them happen intermittently. There are droughts maybe every 20 years or 30 years. Right? This happened once, but it had no effect. It had no change in the world. None. Why should that be remembered? Why would you expect that to be remembered? The miracle there, such as it was the forgetting of a language. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't fire and brimstone falling from heaven. It was the forgetting of a language.
What's the history of the language? How come everyone speaks different languages?
No, that's not necessarily correct. There are sources that say that before the dispersal, every local group had its own different language. There were many different languages always, as far back as you go. And in addition, there was one international language. And what happened was God caused them to forget the international language. Now, if you live in a world in which local groups have their own different languages, but you have one international language, you are not going to make bilingual dictionaries. When you want to speak to somebody else from a different group, you use the international language. So when the international language was forgotten, the groups were in a situation where, at least in immediate terms, they couldn't speak to one another. That's enough to cause a breakdown of communication. But that's not something like a flood. It's not something like the plagues in Egypt or the crossing of the sea. It's not a breakdown in natural law. It's a question of change in human consciousness.
I was just talking to somebody about how people dress, especially like the Haredim. Is there any like source why they wear like, white and black and like just specifically that as opposed to like a blue shirt or a checkered shirt or like gray pants?
Okay, you're asking the question in an interesting way. You're not asking it historically. The truth is that we know from Jewish sources that it wasn't always this way. In fact, the Talmud says that if a person wants to go to some place and be unknown, he should wear black. So I mean, that meant that people didn't wear black. You know, he's going someplace, he's going to be shunned, he's going to be rejected, and so on and so on. So we know that this wasn't always the same way. Now, answering your question the way you put it, I think there are two possible attitudes towards clothes. Either they're strictly utilitarian, they keep you warm, they protect your modesty, privacy, or they carry some significance. They make a statement, they express certain values of your culture. The latter is obviously the case for human culture, and it's obviously the case for Jewish culture. Judges dress in long black gowns, just black. Just black. They did that before air conditioning in July in Tallahassee. Wasn't comfortable, but they did it. If you perform classical music, you will wear a black evening suit or evening gown. Black and formal. If you graduate and receive a degree, you will wear a black gown and an absolutely absurd, ridiculous black hat with a tassel, which you would never wear any other time except for Halloween. And when someone will, that's what you do when you receive a degree. That's how you celebrate receiving a degree. Why? Because formal black clothing expresses value. What's going on is very important. Justice is very important. Beethoven is very important. Education is very important. You don't wear that when you're playing tennis. And you don't wear that when you're going to the local library to read comic books, is what people read today, instead of Shakespeare. So clothes have an expressive value, and they express certain fundamental values. In Judaism, this is certainly the case. The priests, when they did the service in the temple, had to wear a uniform. If they didn't have on the right uniform, the service was invalid. And the way the Talmud puts it is, a Kohen without the appropriate uniform isn't a Kohen. It carries his identity. And you have these tassels that we put on four-cornered garments, and you have the prohibition against mixing linen and wool in your clothes. Obviously, from our point of view, clothes are more than just utilitarian. Now, we look at life as a serious affair. The judge, when he's sitting on the bench, wears his long black robe. When he goes home, he dresses casually because justice is serious and your life at home is casual. It's not as serious in that sense. For us, it's all serious. It's all serious. There aren't any casual moments. That being the case, I mean, you can't relax, but the relaxation is planned. It's sort of like, in between the rounds of a prize fight. Right? So you relax for a minute, but you're going in for the next round. And therefore, black and formal dress definitely expresses that. And colored and variety of colors and so forth and so on also expresses a different attitude toward what you're doing. There's one other thing that I would say, which is worth thinking about. That's the idea of having standardized clothes. Uniforms. Many, not all groups, but many groups, like Hasidic groups, certain Sephardi groups, and in our schools, we definitely, many require the children to wear uniforms. I must tell you, when people learn about this, they often say, but where's your ability to express your individuality? Look at that. It's prescribed to you what clothes you're going to wear. How about expressing your individuality? Good. So when that question is asked, I usually move the discussion to something else, as if I forgot it, and we talk about something else for 20 minutes, and then I ask out of the blue, do you think that you should judge a person by the clothes he wears? Judge his value, his identity, his seriousness, his achievements by the clothes he wears? No, of course not. Person's not his clothes. Oh, so then why would it be important to you to express your individuality through your choice of clothes? Why would that be an important means of expression? If I fail to pay attention to your ideas, to your values, to your needs, to your aspirations as a human being, then you could claim that I don't respect you. You don't want me to pay attention to your clothes. Why should your clothes be an item of interest? You don't think of yourself as identified by your clothes? Then why would having the flexibility to choose your own clothes be an important expression of your individuality? Our attitude is, don't pay attention to clothes. Forget about it. Make it standardized so it's an issue of non-interest, non-attention. Talk about your ideas, your values, your projects, what you care about, what's important to you, and leave clothes out of it. Leave clothes out of it. I think that's part of the idea of having a uniform. But the idea of formal and black is because we think of expressing the idea that life is serious. Life is serious and consequential. It's not just killing time till death.
It is an expression.
Sorry?
So we are using clothes to express.
I'm not getting it.
We are expressing things with clothing.
With the black, yeah, that's right. We're expressing something we all share. We all share the perception that life is serious. Life is consequential. This life is valuable. The choices that we're making are important choices that are important consequences. We are expressing that. Just like all the judges wear the same black gown, and all the Beethoven performers, I was one of them. I know from under the hot lights with the formal black evening suit. But you're all dressing the same way, all expressing the same common value. This has nothing to do with expressing individuality.
So in that aspect, we do want to be judged by. We want to be judged. We want people to look at us and realize that we respect them.
As a group, yes, we're expressing a group value. That's true. Just like, for example, the military, high people in the military will dress in their uniforms. And they dressed in their uniforms when they came to a press conference or when they came to visit the president in the White House before air conditioning, because he's a general in the army. A general in the army wears a uniform because that's what he is. Either other generals, and they also wear similar outfits, but because they are generals in the army, that's a very high value according to this culture.
But a lot of people are like not really that serious, so they just wear it just because everybody else is wearing it.
That's true. A lot of people, when they say hello, how are you, really couldn't care less how you are, right? But the idea of reinforcing a group value by having a common group experience still plays a role. It would be much less vivid, it would be much less strongly adhered to in general if it wasn't expressed as a common group value. So, of course, there'll be varieties of adherence to it. And, you have athletic programs in school. You think that improves children's health. Not all the kids really make an effort. That's not a reason to say we shouldn't do it. We should do it and should get everybody involved to the extent that they can be involved because it's an important value that people's health should be supported by athletics. Yeah.
We were talking about the Tower of Babel before. The Tower of Babel, there was an international language. So obviously the language was
Hebrew.
And also known as Lashon HaKodesh. So my question is, why is it called Lashon HaKodesh? What is Kodesh about it?
There's a variety of answers to that question. Maimonides in the guide says there are no explicit terms for the sexual organs, for excretion. They're all metaphors. They're all metaphors. And he goes through them one by one. That expresses a certain attitude towards the body and towards bodily functions and how we relate it to animals and so forth and so on. The Kabbalistic view is this, that languages other than Hebrew are conventional. Hebrew is not conventional. The letters and the words in Hebrew have an essential relationship with the things that they describe. Fish, F-I-S-H, that sound and those letters could have referred to tables or birds or mathematics. But dag, dalet, gimel in Hebrew, that essentially describes the fish. Now, I can't do that in detail, but I can give you two examples which are similar, where the shapes of the letters connote certain Jewish laws. And I wish they say Solomon could do it for trees and animals. I can't do that, but at least I'll show you the way in which it could be done. In the fall, we have a holiday called Sukkos. We make huts with thatched roofs, so to speak, and we live in those huts. As far as the walls of the hut is concerned, there are three possibilities. Either you can make four sides, completely enclosed, like that, quadrilateral, or you can have three sides, or you can have two adjacent sides, and then a third single board, roughly in the corner facing the adjacent sides. Now, the word sukkah is spelled with three letters. A samach has four enclosed sides. A chaf has three sides. And a hey has an angle with another piece adjacent or facing. The shapes of the letter of the word sukkah describe the shapes of the structure itself. Another one, some of you know that on Pesach we don't eat chametz. Chametz is leavened grain material of the five basic grains. Matzah is the same five grains, unleavened. Matzah you can eat, and chametz you can't eat. Now, these remarks go back to the Gaon of Vilna, for whom that's a meaningful reference. Let's consider the two words chametz and matzah. Chametz is ches mem tzadi. Matzah is mem tzadi, hey. So the two words share the mem tzadi. They just differ in that chametz has a ches and matzah has a hey. Now let's look at them. A ches is three-sided this way. A hey is an angle with a little piece over here. Imagine that little piece grew. Imagine it expanded. Imagine it leavening and rising. What's going to happen? That little piece is going to join with the top, and you're going to get a ches. What is chametz? Chametz is matzah that illicitly rose. The letters show you that. The letters show you that. The hay of matzah becomes the ches of chametz if you take that little piece of the hay and let it rise. So that's an example of how the shapes of the letters can be appropriate to the laws that are being described. Something like that is going on. The shapes, the numerical value of the letters, the sound of the letters, something like that is going on with respect to the creation as a whole. And since the creation of the whole is based on holiness, Lashon HaKodesh means this is the language that expresses the holiness upon which the whole creation is based. And were we to know exactly what the letters mean and how they function, we would be able to make these connections. Sometimes in the Kabbalah you have such connections. So I'm not well versed in the Kabbalah, so I can't say any more than that. But these two I know in terms of the shapes of the letters, and there's examples of how the connection is made. That means the language Hebrew is not a conventional language. It means what it means because it had to be that way. The Torah says that God brought the animals to Adam to see what he would name them. This was not an exercise in making up arbitrary syllables to call them. If so, God wouldn't have done it, and it wouldn't have been recorded. This was essentially, and it showed that Adam's understanding included the connection between Hebrew and the world. Yeah.
When we were in Egypt with the Egyptians ruling over us, it was very much a culture that was steeped in materialism, and also if you look at like Egyptian history and stuff, it was a culture that was very centered around death as well. I mean, they built giant tombs, and they believed that you could take physical items in the afterlife with you. And now we're kind of in Golis now. I mean, we're in Golis now, and you see that a lot of the enemies of the Jewish people are also kind of obsessed with like martyrdom and becoming a shaheed and stuff. And I'm just wondering if you see any sort of parallel to that, or if I'm just kind of going out on a limb here.
Gee, it's a brand new idea for me. I've never thought of that. I don't know much about Egyptian ideology in that respect. The pyramids, I think, don't strike me as monuments to death. Indeed, they mummified the bodies, and they provided them with food and clothing and weapons, in some cases little boats, because they believed that they were going to live again And they were going to need those things. This was not a way of putting a drain on the supply to raise the prices of commodities. That's not why they put these things in the pyramids. So that sounds to me like not accepting death as final. That doesn't sound like worshiping death or having death as a big value. Did soldiers glorify in suicide missions? Not aware that they did. Now you're right that these enemies glorify death. We have a lot of other enemies who don't glorify death. We have a lot of enemies in Europe. They're not looking to become martyrs. They're not looking to blow themselves up. They may be looking to shoot at Jews, but they're not looking to blow themselves up. So I don't know if it'd be fair to say that it characterizes our enemies that they are glorifying death. Christianity fought against us for many centuries, not aware that they glorify death. So I don't know if that would be a good characterization historically throughout history. Now let's say, okay, forget about history. What about now? The people we are facing on the ground now are those kind of people. There's got to be a lesson in that. Diane Ehrentreu, who was one of the great rabbis of London, said a number of years ago in a certain program, quoting a Hasidic source, that if there's something which the non-Jewish world uses against us, that's because we're not using it appropriately. They can only get that leverage against us if we sacrifice that lever. Otherwise, we would have possession of it and they wouldn't be able to do it. At that time, certain groups in London were instituting days of Jewish study, where their Jewish study was not what we would call studying Judaism, studying other stuff. And he said they wouldn't have dreamt of that if it had not been for our laxity in real Jewish study. And I think I heard someone, hope I'm not just quoting myself, I think I heard someone say that the ability to sacrifice your life is something we don't believe in. We don't believe in martyrdom as an end unto itself. Indeed, some medieval commentators say that if you're threatened with the pressure for martyrdom and you can run, run. And if you don't run, you're guilty of suicide. That's Maimonides' view. Others say that if the community is threatened, you can volunteer to take the pressure off the community. But we don't look at it as something that you court, certainly not to kill yourself for a gain. If they're doing that, there's something in the way we live which is depriving us of that lever and giving them that power to do that. But at any rate, I don't know any more than that. And making an association with Egypt, I don't hear a deep association. So you asked the question in the right way, and I'm giving you my impression. But ask others. I'm not. It's not something that I'm well schooled in. Yeah.
You mentioned the concept that the default position of Midrashic sources is that it's parable. This is limited to Midrash and not, let's say, Gemara.
No, it's Midrash. The Gemara, it depends upon the context. It depends upon the kind of language that's used. Many things in the Talmud are parables. The Talmud took its inspiration from the prophets, and the prophets famously speak in parables. Solomon speaks about the wise who express themselves in parables, and sages of the Talmud knew what Solomon wrote, and they took it seriously. So it's not surprising. So then you have to sort it through either the type of language that's used, or you have to sort it through the commentators. For us, the Talmud is what the medieval commentators say it is. There is no Talmud other than that. When it comes to the Tanakh, here's a very important point. This, along with many other things that I'm telling you, I've learned from Rabbi Moshe Meiselman, who's a teacher of mine, and who put out a book on Torah and science a year and a half ago, 900 pages long, and it is a classic. If you have questions about Torah and science, that's the book to read. And if you haven't read that book, you have no right to an opinion. And if you're a blood-red American who says everyone has a right to his opinion, then I disagree with you. You have a right to an opinion if you studied the subject, thought about it, conversed about it, analyzed it. To have an opinion about something you know nothing about, why do you have a right to an opinion? Right to opinion doesn't come because you're breathing. Right to opinion comes with paying the dues of studying it and becoming knowledgeable about it. At any rate, the fundamental point here is that whereas the prophets and in the writings you have many parables, there are no parables in the 5 books of Moses. None. So anyone who wants to opt for saying that the Garden of Eden is a parable, or the story of the flood is a parable, or the story of the patriarchs is a parable. There's not a single source in our classical sources that takes that position, and many take the position against it, and Maimonides is explicit about it. And there's a verse in which God berates Miriam and Aaron for challenging Moses' authority. And one of the things that God says is, you're not like Moses. No other prophet is like Moses. He's unique in a variety of ways. And one of them is that I speak to the other prophets in parables, and not so to Moses. So in Moses' case, although you can have metaphor, you don't have parable. Those are different, and in an interesting way, which Rabbi Meisman describes in detail. I'll tell you just so it'll be on record. A word can be used in a variety of ways. The same word. Lave. Lave in Hebrew is what's translated as heart. So in mammals, it refers to the pump in the middle of your chest that beats the blood around the circulatory system. You have a verse in the Tanakh which talks about Lev HaShamayim, the heart of the heavens. No one believes that there's a circulatory system in the heavens, and there's a pump there pumping some fluid going through all the heavens. No. There, the word Lev means the central, most important section of a thing. So sometimes Lev can mean heart, and then sometimes it can mean central, most important part of something. We naturally classify words as literal and metaphorical. That's a long study, it's a long story. One of the things I studied in graduate school, I'm not going to take you into that now. We have a pretty intuitive idea. When you say that this table is hard, that's literal. When you say it's a hard question, that's a metaphor. When you use a word metaphorically, you're using it to describe something factually. You're trying to say something that's true. Only one word can mean different things in different contexts. Built. If you say George built the campfire, we know what that means. When you say Solomon built the temple, which it does say, it means something else. It means he had thousands of workers whom he assigned to that project. Doesn't mean he did it with his own hands. So build can mean use your hands to manipulate the materials, and build can mean have it done by others who are under your authority. That's metaphor. Metaphor is used to tell a story that's supposed to be true. It's just that you have a flexibility of using words in different ways. Parable is something else entirely. In a parable, typically all the words are used literally to tell a story that's false. It's a false story. It never happened. It's just supposed to teach a moral. Aesop's fables. Aesop's fables are all false stories. The fox who wanted to get the grapes, and the only hole in the fence was very thin. So he starved himself to become so thin to get in to eat the grapes. He loved the grapes, gorged himself on the grapes. He's too big to get out the hole. So now I was going to get back out the hole. Got to starve himself, become so thin to get out the hole. He comes out of the hole, and he's just as thin and starving as he was before. There's no fox, there's no grapes, there's no fence, there's no hole. It's all made up. The words are all used literally. The word fox means fox. The word fence means fence. The word hole means hole. It's telling a fantasy story. That's a parable. That's the difference between metaphor and parable. The Torah contains metaphors. In one place it describes the cities of Canaan that we have to conquer as fortified to the heavens. No city is fortified to the heavens. And don't tell me it's the Torah and God speaking and God can do anything and who knows. And then maybe. The Talmud says it's a guzma. It's an exaggeration. It's a metaphor. For when you look at it, you're overwhelmed. You can't imagine conquering it. You can't imagine fighting against it. It looks, as we say in English, impregnable. It's impossible to conquer. That's a metaphor. But it's a metaphor to describe a reality. That's what's wrong with saying that let's say the Garden of Eden is a parable. Parable would mean Adam is a person. The word Adam means a person, and snake means a snake, but it never happened. It's a fairy story, like Aesop's fables, meant to teach morals and values and so forth and so on. That's absolutely outside the pale of the Jewish tradition. Metaphor, yes. Parable, no, in the 5 books of Moses. The prophets use parables all the time. Rabbis in the Talmud also often told parables, often describe real historical events. It's not easy to tell which. That's why we have to read the commentaries.
So one of the source for the fact that the default position of Medrash is
Maral. Who says that you treat every midrash as non-literal unless you have commentaries that say.
Where does the Maral say that?
Where does he say? I think it's in Chiddush Agados, but I'm not quite sure. I don't know where. Yeah.
I always had this question about how all the Jews, they're like, that we read in the Torah, everybody knows that we're Jewish, and like, there's Israel, but like the enemy of the Jews, which is like the Amalek that like we talk about in like different sources. Right nowadays, we don't know who they are. So isn't that kind of not fair? Because we're supposed to like, they're supposed to like clash. So if you don't know who they are, then, I mean, you kind of left. You can't. It's a tough battle because you don't know who they are. So
You mean
it's like,
our responsibility to wipe out Amalek? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that. But also like just to know like where they are. Like why are they not in the world? Like why aren't they?
Identified.
Yeah.
Well, our tradition traces this back to the military campaigns of Sancherib, where he displaced populations and mixed populations. And not only is Amalek unidentified, Ishmael is unidentified. The Rambam says, why do Arabs, Muslims, do circumcision? From our point of view, the mitzvah of circumcision was given to Abraham and some of his descendants. If you read the verses carefully. And there's one verse that excludes Ishmael and one verse that excludes Esau. That's Ishmael, who today is thought of as the Muslims, or the Arabs anyway, and Esau, who became eventually Rome and the Christians. They're excluded. So why do they do it? Because after Sarah died, Abraham remarried, and he had at least 6 more sons. They are obligated. But we don't know where they are. We don't know where the descendants are. And since Sancherib mixed up these populations, the Arabs have in them some of these other sons of Abraham. And that's why they perform circumcision, because a particular Arab might be descended from those other sons of Abraham, but not in terms of their own. So this mixture of populations and inability to identify people in populations is general. Nothing to do in particular with Amalek. We've just lost the lineages of the populations that we're dealing with. Now, whether we need to know that or don't need to know that, Kodesh Baruch Hu sets up the information in such a way that we can do the mitzvahs that He wants us to do at any particular time. That's a general, that's a global kind of statement. It's also the same is true with respect to halacha. When we forget a law, that's not. We do forget laws. Not everything was remembered perfectly. That's because God wants us to deal with the general principles for acting on the basis of a missing law, and there are general principles which then just prescribe certain ways to deal with it. For example, if it's a biblical law and you don't know whether the truth is A or B, you have to work in such a way as to satisfy both of them. If it's a rabbinic law, then you don't have to satisfy both of them. So that if we forget a biblical law that's going to introduce a new stringency of action, if we forget a rabbinic law, it's not going to introduce a new stringency of action, it may introduce even a leniency in action. God may want us to be more stringent in that and less stringent in this. He causes us to forget in that way that He gets us to act in the way that He wants us to act, without new prophecy, without new legislation, which can't be done. So I think it's a global phenomenon, the fact that we don't know who's who, and that means we can't deal with it.
Can't do it.
I mean, any more than the Chafetz Chaim, whose scholarship was socially tuned. Everything he wrote for people who needed to hear these words. He wrote a book for soldiers, for Jewish soldiers, how to conduct yourself in the army. If you're under fire, you're not under fire. He wrote a book of the mitzvos that are applicable in our time. You've probably heard the number 613. There's about 240 that are applicable now. Majority are just not applicable. So someone could say, I have so many responsibilities to bring sacrifices, and there's no temple to do it in. That's right. There is no temple to do it in. If we were more sensitive, we'd lose sleep over that. But I'm missing out. There are a lot of mitzvos that I'm not doing. God wants us to be in a position where we can't do them for whatever reason. So this piece of information is something that's missing. God put us in a position where, at least temporarily, we can't do this mitzvah. Yeah.
My question is based off a certain understanding, so can I just say the understanding and then ask the question? My understanding of Maimonides' conception of the next world is based off a person's intellectual appreciation of God, in the mitzvahs of the Torah world. Thereby, a question arises, what happens if a person is born into this world who's intellectually incapable of understanding God, be it accident or just simply just not intellectually being there? could it be a possible answer to say that similar to Gugulin, for the Rambam, a way of suppose answering that is the Rambam's reason for Tchias HaMesim, because he also seems to say that Tchias HaMesim is not permanent like the Mukabalim. He seems to say that it will end and then we'll go on to a spiritual existence afterwards. Could that section be his way of making God just, so to speak?
Except for the last thing that you said, but I'm going to point out that not quite exactly the way you formulated it. Yes, this is an idea that I think has a lot of merit. I'll explain to the company what's going on here. I think this idea has a lot of merit. I've been using it myself for, I don't know, for 10 years or more, and I think, although I can't prove it, but I think the idea has a lot of merit. Maimonides says that, so first thing he says something which, although there were one or two other medievals who took this position, I think it's been eclipsed. I don't think anybody takes a position today that in the world to come, there's only the soul. The body is not there. Only the soul. Now, the soul is most essentially the intellect. The intellect comes to know God. Knowledge is absorbing ideas into the intellect which change the quality of the intellect. Intellect is an understanding. When you get a new idea, your understanding is a different understanding. It's not the same understanding as it was before. That's what goes into the world to come, that understanding. I'm skipping over a lot because love is there also. Now he asks, what about a person who didn't achieve that understanding for whatever reason? He lived in a time of war and poverty and disease, and he was running for his life and so forth and so on. He kept the commandments, he feared God, he loved God, he served God faithfully, but he didn't achieve that understanding. Are we to believe that he's not going to go to the world to come? Because the way you get in is through that understanding? Well, Maimonides, along with everybody else, has as a principle of Jewish belief, resurrection. Resurrection means that a person dies, body is buried, the soul is preserved in a sort of waiting position until this body and soul are rejoined, reunited. At that point, after resurrection, that person, body plus soul, soul plus body, lives for some period of time. At that time, he could get the intellectual understanding, which is the vehicle for existence in the world to come. And then he will die again, because only the soul goes into the world to come, not the body. Now, as he points out, if you look at Maimonides' official view, which, again, I think has been eclipsed, there's no end to this world ever. So after the resurrection and the coming of the Messiah, this world doesn't disappear. It keeps going. You may have heard of the 6,000-year limit. Maimonides rejects it on the grounds that in the Talmud it's the view of one scholar only. It's never voted upon. It's never codified. And he rejects it. And so does the Abarbanel reject it. So it goes on forever. Those people, after the coming of the Messiah, don't have another resurrection. Resurrection is once. The thought is resurrection is necessary because we are going through a period of history where people don't manage to achieve what's necessary for the world to come. After the coming of the Messiah, there won't be wars, there won't be disease. There'll be a more idyllic human existence where people in a normal lifetime will be able to achieve what's necessary for the world to come. So resurrection becomes the vehicle to make up for that loss in our section of history. I think that's a very reasonable explanation. And although he doesn't say that anywhere explicitly, it fits into his philosophy and into the general themes of Jewish philosophy, I think, very well. Now, I've tried this out on scholars, and typically they say, nice idea. No one has ever told me anything which he thought refuted it or was an objection to it. Of course, we are hesitant to say something for which we have no direct source, but in terms of its fitting the logical situation, I think it's very good.